It's 1982. Roberto Calvi's lifeless body is hanging from a bridge. The press called him God's banker for helping the Vatican launder money. Was it simply a suicide, or did high-ranking Italians and church officials think he knew too much? Hey guys, I'm Drew. This is a summary of the best-selling book, God's Bankers, A History of Money and Power in the Vatican. If you want me to make more video book summaries like this, please subscribe. Have you ever wondered why the Vatican is its own country? During the Great Depression, Italian Prime Minister Mussolini cut a deal with the Pope that would change the world. If the Vatican would give its blessing to the fascist party, Mussolini would recognize it as a sovereign nation, and he would pay the church $1.4 billion, which was about 1/3 of Italy's entire annual budget. The Vatican used the money to invest heavily in German and Italian companies, and they achieved impressive returns. But in 1941, countless German and Polish priests informed the Pope about the gruesome details of the Holocaust. Now, the Pope had real power because 1 in 3 Germans were Catholic. So, if he spoke out, he could potentially convince the Germans to stop the atrocities. The British, French, and Americans begged the Pope to put an end to it. But he did nothing. Why? Well, for one, he was afraid of angering the Nazis. But that can't just be it. Because in 1944, when it was obvious the Germans were losing the war, the Pope still didn't speak out. So what was the real reason? Money. You see, the Pope cut a deal with Hitler, similar to the one with Mussolini. One of the implications was that if the Pope spoke out, the Nazis would seize all the church's German holdings. Meanwhile, the Allies had blacklisted any country doing business with the Nazis. Yet, somehow, the Vatican was the only country in Europe not blacklisted. Why? FDR was afraid of the powerful US Catholic community, and this allowed the Vatican to play both sides, doing business with both the Allies and the Axis. So the Nazis used the Vatican Bank to launder blood money, and the Allies knew this. And get this, many Jews had life insurance with Italian insurance companies. And when the Nazis murdered their family members, they tried to collect their payouts. But the insurance companies denied them, because, well, what were those powerless Jews going to do about it? Later, investigators estimated these companies stole over $200 billion from the Jews. It was one of the biggest thefts of all time, the equivalent of stealing about half of all the silver in the world. And guess who profited? The Vatican, who was a major stakeholder in many of the life insurance companies. It gets worse. After the war, former Nazis took their stolen wealth, including gold bars taken from concentration camps, and hid it in the Vatican, with the help of the Vatican. Yes, the Vatican purposely helped the Nazis smuggle their stolen gold out of Europe. And the Allies knew this too, but they were too afraid of the church to do anything. In one particularly horrific example, US intelligence reported that Croatian church officials used the Vatican to launder $530 million that they stole from Jews murdered in the Holocaust. They literally drove 10 truckloads of gold from Switzerland to the Vatican and then sent it to Argentina and Brazil. And the church didn't just smuggle out Nazi blood money, they smuggled out actual Nazis. They arranged fake passports for SS officials, and not just low-level foot soldiers, but high-level officials like the commandant of a concentration camp that gassed over 1 million Jews. Fast forward, during the 1950s and 60s, the Vatican hired banking mogul Michele Sindona to help grow its portfolio. Except, no one knew at the time that Sindona's banking empire was on the verge of collapse. Sindona taught Paul Marcinkus, who was the head of the Vatican Bank, how to set up offshore shell companies to bypass Italy's currency restrictions. Sindona also taught the same to Roberto Calvi, the president of one of Italy's largest banks, Banco Ambrosiano. Calvi's wealthy clients, some with mafia connections, wanted to smuggle money out of the country into offshore tax havens. So, Calvi cut a deal with Marcinkus, who used the Vatican to get the money out. So, why would Marcinkus and the Vatican do this? Simple. They got a cut of whatever money they laundered. And they were co-owners because they loaned or invested $175 million into Calvi's shell companies. The Vatican invested billions with Sindona and Calvi, who the Italian press dubbed as God's bankers. Sindona began making riskier and riskier financial bets, including purchasing Franklin National, a $3.4 billion American bank. But Sindona had a problem. He lost a fortune speculating on foreign currency. And when the news broke, Franklin's stock price dropped 80%. Now, Sindona was in serious trouble. He begged Marcinkus for a bailout, but Marcinkus refused. Then, he tried blackmailing Marcinkus, but Marcinkus didn't budge. In 1974, Franklin Bank collapsed. It was the largest bank failure in US history. Regulators charged Sindona with breaking a slew of laws, but instead of turning himself in, he went on the run. Italian officials estimated the Vatican Bank lost up to $4 billion with Sindona's collapse. But instead of reducing the Vatican's exposure to these risky opportunities, Marcinkus upped the ante, pumping in $1.2 billion into Calvi's investments. Then, in 1979, a prosecutor in Milan began investigating Calvi for money laundering, but somebody was determined to stop him. 8 days later, after the prosecutor dropped his son off at school, 5 masked men ripped him out of his car, forced him onto his knees, and executed him. And then things were about to get really crazy. The Sindona investigation heated up when another Italian prosecutor found that Sindona had paid $6 million in illegal kickbacks to Marcinkus and Calvi. A month later, 3 men ambushed the same prosecutor at night and shot him to death. Police instantly suspected Sindona. Then, 2 days after that, another police lieutenant involved in the case was gunned down. Then, 8 days after that, another investigator working the case was shot in the head. And then, a year after that, that guy's successor was murdered while he was out walking his 4-year-old daughter. It was a bad time to be a prosecutor investigating Italians with mafia connections. Years later, the FBI learned that Sindona had, in fact, paid the mafia to assassinate the Italian prosecutor who was investigating him. It just kept getting crazier. 3 weeks after all the prosecutors were murdered, Sindona's family reported him missing. An unidentified man called and said,
Abbiamo Michele Sindona come nostro prigioniero. Ci sentiremo.
A few days later, the kidnappers called in again.
Ecco la giustizia proletaria. Michele Sindona verrà giustiziato domani all'alba con il plotone di esecuzione.
Then, radio silence. 76 days later, a delirious Sindona showed up in the middle of Manhattan with a bullet wound in his thigh. He claimed that he was kidnapped by radical leftists angry about his financial crimes. Now back in the US, all Sindona could worry about was his upcoming trial, so he begged Marcinkus to testify about his good character. Marcinkus agreed. However, Vatican insiders were worried about bad PR, so they blocked him from testifying. Marcinkus fought hard but failed. During the trial, the FBI released evidence that Sindona faked his own kidnapping. He was actually just vacationing around Europe the whole time. A doctor told Sindona where a gunshot would do the least damage. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. So, why did Marcinkus, the head of the Vatican Bank, fight so hard to defend this criminal? To answer that question, we have to go to Poland. You see, Solidarity, an anti-communist labor union, was gaining power. And you know who else was Polish and anti-communist? Pope John Paul. The Pope ordered Marcinkus to funnel money from the Vatican Bank to Solidarity. So, how did Marcinkus do it? His priests drove SUVs full of gold bars into Poland. And how did the Vatican get the money to fund Solidarity? In large part due to Sindona and Calvi. Meanwhile, in 1981, Calvi was finally indicted for illegally smuggling out currency. The Ambrosiano stock price fell 40% in just a few weeks. The Ambrosiano remained a powder keg. Calvi owed a lot of money. His shell companies in Peru, Nicaragua, the Bahamas, and Panama had borrowed $1 billion from the Vatican and other banks. Why did Calvi borrow $1 billion? To artificially inflate his company's share prices. And if Calvi's shell companies collapsed, the Vatican could lose $170 million. Calvi's nervous creditors were calling in loans, so Calvi asked Marcinkus to help calm them down. He wanted Marcinkus to issue letters of patronage that basically said, "We, the Vatican, own these shitty shell companies, so don't worry, we're good for it." Marcinkus agreed. These letters would become the smoking gun that later came back to haunt them. Marcinkus publicly supported Calvi in newspaper interviews, saying he completely trusted him. However, the bank's suspicious board members did not trust Calvi. One director was trying to warn the Pope about Calvi when he was shot in the back by a mafia crime boss. He survived. Of course, Calvi said publicly that he was devastated someone would dare go after one of his own board members. But surprise, surprise, investigators later discovered that Calvi was actually the one who paid the mafia hitman $150,000. Soon after, prosecutors demanded that Calvi explain where the $1.4 billion Vatican loan had gone. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Then, like Sindona, he went on the run. A week later, the London police found his lifeless body hanging from a bridge with rocks stuffed in his jacket. The police ruled that Roberto Calvi had killed himself. His family argued that he was murdered. It became one of the most famous unsolved murder cases of all time, and we wouldn't learn what happened until 20 years later. With Calvi dead and Sindona fighting for his life, Marcinkus became the next target. Remember those letters of patronage Marcinkus gave to Calvi? The ones admitting the Vatican itself owned all the shady shell companies? Well, the press found out, and soon powerful Vatican insiders and Italian officials lobbied the Pope to fire Marcinkus. Of course, Marcinkus denied everything. Yet despite all this, the Pope didn't fire him. Then things got even worse for the Vatican. In 1982, Banco Ambrosiano collapsed. The $1.4 billion failure was the biggest in Italian history. The Vatican remained silent throughout the scandal, claiming it was duped by Calvi, who was the real mastermind. The Italian government was furious. So, to take the heat off, in an unprecedented move, the Pope paid a $244 million settlement. Meanwhile, the authorities secretly offered Sindona leniency if he shared information on Calvi or mafia money laundering. To prevent suicide or poisoning, prison guards watched him by video 24 hours a day. His food was specially prepared and sealed. Yet just 2 days after Sindona had arrived, he clutched his throat and shouted,
Sono stato avvelenato. Sono stato avvelenato.
He died from a lethal dose of cyanide in his espresso. Yet, despite all this, inspectors ruled that Sindona had committed suicide. Then, in 1987, the hammer was to come down on Marcinkus. You see, prosecutors found a safe deposit box containing documents that proved the Vatican and Marcinkus knew exactly what Calvi was up to. So yeah, they were totally lying when they said Calvi had duped them. Marcinkus was now a wanted fugitive, hiding in the Vatican. The Italian police issued an arrest warrant, but Italy's Supreme Court ruled they had no right, because the Vatican was a sovereign country. Marcinkus was now free to go. The police were furious. With this ruling, mafia bosses could now safely launder drug money through the Vatican Bank, and no one could stop them. Remember, this is a tiny country right in the middle of Rome. The loophole is so big, why bother having anti-money laundering rules at all? So, what happened to Marcinkus? Unlike Sindona and Calvi, both dead, Marcinkus got off scot-free. Mostly. After losing an internal power struggle, he left the Vatican to become a pastor in Arizona. Tired of the scandals, the Vatican hired a reformer, Angelo Colloia, to clean things up. But other insiders blocked him, because they didn't really want reform. Despite this, Colloia made a major discovery. So, for decades, the Vatican claimed that it was just a bank for religious organizations. Yet, it turned out, 80% of its accounts were owned by powerful Italians. And why did so many powerful Italians want Vatican accounts? Simple. Nobody asked questions. Then, in 1990, another scandal erupted at the Vatican. An Italian industrialist had paid over $150 million in bribes to dozens of politicians. Want to guess what bank he used to pay half the bribes? Prosecutors begged the Vatican to release documents relating to the crime. The Vatican denied every request. And the scandals kept coming. In 1996, a former CIA agent charged with smuggling arms, drugs, and plutonium confessed that a cardinal helped him launder over $100 million through the Vatican Bank. So how much money was the Vatican actually laundering? In 2000, the University of Melbourne published a list of the world's top money launderers. The Vatican was number 8. Another report estimated that the Vatican laundered over $55 billion a year. And then the pedophile scandal broke, which brought the church to its knees. Sorry. roughly 1 in 10 Catholic priests were accused of sexual abuse by 100,000 victims, which is about the population of Green Bay, Wisconsin. And few of those priests were punished, because less than 5% of the incidents were ever reported to the police. The church was forced to pay over $2 billion in settlements, just in America. They paid $1 billion in legal fees alone. Fortunately, this story has a happier ending. When Pope Francis came to power in 2013, he immediately got to work reforming the Vatican Bank. And his efforts appear to be working, or at least the Vatican is no longer a top 10 money laundering destination. And remember Angelo Caloia, who was hired to clean up the Vatican? Well, while I was writing the script for this video, the reformer himself was sentenced to prison for embezzlement and money laundering. So, whatever happened to God's banker Calvi? 20 years after he was found swinging from a bridge, a forensic report confirmed that he didn't, in fact, commit suicide. He was murdered. Hey guys, this video took me over a month to make, so if you'd like me to make more summaries like this, please subscribe. Thanks. If you're interested, check out the book God's Bankers in the description.